half an hour with BBC One and Newscast.
Chris, we've got a cabinet minister to keep us company this episode.
Yes.
Mel Stride, Work and Pension Secretary. Hello.
Good evening, Adam.
And I'm impressed you've got a crib sheet there already. Start taking notes already.
Well, I've only written about 3 things down because we've only started. But, I promise it'll be full.
Yeah, then we'll mark your homework.
The event.
We'll mark your homework like a human version of the OBR, as if. I've got to ask you the big question that has become the classic political interview question this week after the Prime Minister's interview with Grazia. Do you make your own bed?
No.
Okay.
I do. But I do load the dishwasher.
Okay.
I do walk the dog. And as Mrs. May would approve, I do take the bins out because that is a man's job. Yes. So I do that as well.
And Chris, I want to know what you thought about that, seeing the Prime Minister talking about an unmade bed after you had been talking to the nation about your unmade bed in that Premier Inn the other day.
Yeah, I should explain to newscasters and to Mel, who may not have caught that particular newscast, that about a fortnight ago, I was in Wellingborough. So I was covering the by-election in Wellingborough, and I'd woken up at about 5 a.m. To write a piece for the Today programme and all the rest of it. And we were doing a newscast that was live on the iPlayer at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm in a budget hotel. And I got out of bed and went to the little desk and was doing my thing and then fired up the call to talk to Newscast. And all we ended up talking about, in amongst the sprinkling of psephology, was the fact my bed wasn't made. I mean, I just never make my bed in the same way that I don't wash the tyres on a car.
Yeah, but you know
what's the point?
But the reason
get back in it again.
But the reason those things strike a chord is because everyone does them.
Or doesn't.
Most things that a Prime Minister does, most people don't do.
No, sure. Oh no, I get why it strikes a chord as a Grazia line of questioning.
Just not for you.
I'm just in a different place from the Prime Minister on that one. I just don't bother making a bed.
Anyway, we're all in the right place to make an episode of Newscast, which I promise will be more serious from now on.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And we've got Mel Stride, who's the Work and Pension Secretary. Hello.
Hello, Adam.
Is it true that they used to say when the government was in a bit of a sticky wicket, unshell the Mel? Because they'd send you out to defend them.
They used to say, don't hide the stride.
That was the other
I've
never heard that one.
And this followed on from Uncork the Gore.
Indeed.
Yes, David Gore.
So when we both had the same position at different times, obviously, at the Treasury, Financial Secretary of the Treasury, and when there were things to damp down, the dead bat to be applied, unshell the Mel would be the call. And out I would go. There'll be no dead batting here today, I can assure you. But yes,
that was a thing you'd have to do, like just actually not make any waves, just be quite defensive, just like calm things down.
There would inevitably be some. Well, you're very old hands. There'd be some things that would crop up, and you had to go out and try and douse it down. And sometimes they would send me to do that. So I wore it as a badge of honour, I have to say.
Right, on to business, Chris. Everyone's had a chance to sleep on the budget now.
Yes.
Another bed reference. I can't help myself. What are your thoughts?
So there's a couple of things to think today. So there's been a bit of a thing today, hasn't there, about the Conservatives, the Chancellor, sort of rating this sort of aspiration, not a promise, a sort of ambition to scrap national insurance contributions. We've seen these cuts, 2 rounds of 2p cuts. And then he sort of entertained the idea that maybe you could get rid of them. But without saying, it is our policy to get rid of them.
Or a pledge, or a plan.
Indeed. And then you've got Labour trying to make an argument that says this is a giant unfunded kind of tax cut promise, except it isn't quite a promise. And so what I think you've got is the Conservatives seeking to point to a dividing line of aspiration, if you like, because it's not really a dividing line because it's not really a policy, but it gets you some way, I suppose, to a sense of where the Conservatives would like to go. With Labour arguing that this is sort of irresponsible, and I noticed that they this afternoon in a social media thing did that whole facial merging thing where they got the Prime Minister and Liz Truss, and half the face was Rishi Sunak and half the face was Liz Truss, to try and make an argument about hauling him into the legacy of the Truss administration, which from their perspective they think they can get some mileage out of.
Now, loads of things we could ask you then. What is the right words to describe the long-term goal when it comes to national insurance? Is it a pledge, an aspiration?
I think it's a direction of travel. It's an aspiration. It's a declaration of intent, but it is not a hard, firm pledge. Now, of course, the Labour Party want to transmogrify it into that, because then that allows them to say that we're being fiscally irresponsible. It's going to cost £46 billion. Although in typical sort of Labour fashion, the 46, some of the backbenchers had started adding a few billion. It became 48, but that's what Labour's like, isn't it? They like to add a little bit along the way.
But is it anything if it's not a promise?
I think aspirations, direction of travel, is something that's legitimate. And in the absence of that, you might be saying to me, where's the vision?
Okay.
No, so Rishi Sunak never has any vision. He's all about today. He's about, managing his way through. So there we are. You've got a bit of vision. We want to see a lower tax society. And we've got 2 down payments on it now with these national insurance cuts. So 27 million people are going to be £900 a year better off because of the national insurance cuts if they're employees. Or if they're self-employed, they're going to be £650 better off this year.
I suppose then the next question on the aspiration around the abolition of national insurance is that if you could get to that point, and I know from speaking to people in government, people are acknowledging, look, it'd only be possible if they concluded it was responsible at the time and it could take quite a long time to get there, etc., etc. But if you manage to get there, that comes with a consequence, a trade-off, doesn't it, in terms of that revenue stream of tax not being there and therefore stuff that you can't spend money on that you're currently spending money on, and what that might be.
So you've got the various moving macroeconomic parts. You've got the spending, you've got the taxing, you've got the growth, and between those different things, you've got to make sure you hit your fiscal targets, and that will ever be the case. Now, there could be arguments about whether fiscal targets might be changed, but apart from that, you are working within those parameters. So you're right, they're trade-offs.
So to put it more bluntly, if you aspire to cut a tax that currently generates £40+ billion, where do you aspire to spend minus 40 billion compared with what you're spending now?
Well, that's a horror show of a question. I mean, there's no way in today's climate any chancellor's going to start saying, well, we're suddenly going to reduce spending by 40 billion. You try to go out on one side of the ledger and not on the other.
No,
but an aspiration is for something in the future. And as you've recognised, these things can take quite a long period of time. So nobody is going to have this in one bound, Jack was free, we're suddenly going to do this thing overnight. This will be an endeavour that will take time. It'll have to be done in a fiscally responsible manner, which means that every fiscal event, we're going to have to stick to those fiscal rules and move forward in that direction. But of course, it will take a lot of time. It's certainly not going to happen overnight.
There are plenty of people right now who will say, plenty of newscasters might say that the size of the state is too big. The state should be doing less. Are there things that would run into the tens of billions that you can think of right now that perhaps the government shouldn't be doing? In other words, that would help work out that ledger, that if you're not going to have 40 billion plus of tax revenue from national insurance, then you can't spend it on X.
It's very kind of you to invite me to start giving you a shopping list of tens of billions of different changes that might free up that kind of money. Chris, you are a kind and decent man.
Chancellor Rail Strike 2028.
Yeah. I'm afraid the dead bat has just come. It's thumped down on the ground.
Right.
No, I mean, look, these things take a lot of time. I mean, just to take national insurance down, a percent is about 5 billion or thereabouts. So, you'd have to do it in stages and you'd have to find the money, hopefully through growing the economy. Because look, why have we dropped national insurance? It's a tax on jobs. One of the things that's holding the economy back is a tight labour market. Now, the OBR says that those 2 tax cuts, this fiscal event and the last, will free up about 200,000 full-time equivalent additional people in the labour market by the end of the forecast period. That's about 20% of the vacancies in the economy at the moment. So that will have a huge supply-side boost to the economy, and that's why you go for those kind of taxes. Now, if we can keep getting growth going, and we're going to outgrow, according to the OBI, France and Germany and Italy and Japan and so on, going forward over the next 5 years.
Not necessarily
then
on
we
a
can,
person basis.
Well, in terms of GDP growth, which is relevant to the questions that Chris is asking about where do you find the money, then if we can continue to do that, then we can start to find that money to do that. And that will be a priority. We'll be getting taxes down. And national insurance, very sensible tax to reduce.
Would you like the abolition of national insurance to be in the Conservative manifesto?
I'm not going to speculate on the Tory party manifesto. But I would be very surprised if there was not a serious aspiration to continue on this path of reducing taxes beyond the next general election. But it's not for me to start speculating on that.
So in Wednesday's
Sounds
episode,
almost like a dead bat. Yes.
It was that was half a dead bat. That was sort of,
I don't know enough about cricket
it was
to
half.
characterise it.
It wasn't a completely dead parrot.
No.
It was twitching.
There was
Chris.
exactly.
It
There
was
was
twitching.
a
Okay.
smidgen of an answer in there.
Yeah.
On Wednesday's episode of Newscast, the podcast, we had a question from newscaster Alan asking about what was in this for pensioners. And we talked about it. We kicked around the numbers, looking at the Red Book and what the OBR was saying. And then Alan got back in touch today to say, your guests were dead right, of course. Pensioners will lose out. As a way of proving the case, my own circumstances are that my wife and I live on my occupational pension and my state pension. As each year passes, Alan says, I'm paying increasingly large amounts of standard rate income tax. Therefore, I'm losing 20% of a sizable chunk of my pension income. Alternatively, my 25-year-old single son, who is slightly above UK mean average salary, this is a long email, Alan, will benefit by around £1,100 next tax year. It looks like the Tories will lose their quota of silver voters at the next election. I have voted Tory all my life, says Alan, and then he signs off, not anymore.
Okay, well, my message to Alan is this, that pensioners are absolutely at the heart of the concerns of this government and have been, not just in this budget, but
Apart from
over
yesterday.
not just in this budget, but across a broader period of time. So we have stuck to the triple lock. We introduced it. We've stuck by it. Many people like Chris and others and yourself have been saying, well, is that fiscally sustainable, etc.? We say we stand by our pensioners, okay? So pensions went up by 10.1% to cover this year, a further 8.5%. That's way above the level of inflation for next year. Pension credit, which is there for the less well-off pensioners. My department's done a huge amount to expand the number of pensioners that are qualifying and getting into that extra support. Things like the local housing allowance that we put up to the 30th percentile. This is for private renters to give them extra help with those costs. Is worth £800 to 1.6 million people. That kicks in April. Many of those will be pensioners. Cost of living payments were targeted specifically, amongst others, at pensioners. And look, the proof point is this. If you went back to the last Labour government, we would have a legitimate conversation about deep pensioner poverty. It was an area in which poverty was concentrated, was amongst the elderly. That was not right. And we have put that right. There are 200,000 fewer people now in absolute poverty after housing costs since 2010. So I think our record on pensioners is really strong. And we recognise that it's difficult for them to change their economic circumstances through going out to work, etc. And therefore, we have a duty to really look after them. And I believe that we have, and we will continue to do so.
And very quickly, David Cameron got lots of plaudits for his social media video where he listed all his achievements, but while walking very purposely down the Foreign Office stairs across the street. I just wondered, has he been copying you? Because I went on your social media feed. It's like every video is just like you walking somewhere. Job centre, office, taking the dog.
Yeah, people say I'm the new Grant Shapps, you see. I'm not. But anyway, who knows?
His self-promotion stakes.
Yeah, who knows? Now, I'm sure David's quite capable of doing his own thing. I was well put together. I thought it was very good.
Talking about cabinet ministers' contributions to social media, should someone remain in the cabinet if they've contributed to social media and cost the taxpayer £15,000 in damages? I refer to your colleague Michelle Donovan, the Science Secretary.
So you're referring here to a letter that Michelle sent to somebody making an accusation which turned out to not be the case.
And she posted it on Twitter.
So my understanding is the department has sorted that out as quickly as possible, and that's why it's 15,000 and not a much larger sum, without any admission associated with it. But I do think there's a fundamental point here, because if we were, as the sort of natural extension of your question, Chris, to say, well, actually, what we should do is just leave ministers to pay those things themselves, which is what I gather Keir Starmer is calling for. And I think it'd be a pretty frightening place for most ministers in departments. They'd be worried about what they said to almost anybody. So I think it's quite right that if somebody
Shouldn't they be worried about what they say?
Well, they should be, but not to the extent that they'd be worried about tripping themselves into those situations. And look, she was acting as a minister on advice of civil servants, and I don't think it's unreasonable that in that capacity she should have.
I suppose there's
that kind of
there's that element
support
to it, which is kind of who pays the bill. There's also the judgment element of it, isn't there? Which is that should a cabinet minister be, tweeting this sort of stuff out?
I don't know what advice Michelle received at that time. I could only assume that she would have had discussions within the department, and acting as a minister, you'd have expected her to have had that, whether she had legal advice, whether she had policy advice, whether she had just advice from a private office I've no idea. But I think the principle of a minister functioning as a minister and having that support in that way is not.
Doesn't that even point to a deeper failing then within the department? If she has had advice that turns out to be dud, given what's happened now, this isn't just a minister deciding to stab stuff out on the phone on the way home, and and all the rest of it. It's something that has a depth to it where there's been a failure.
Well, we're speculating, so neither of us know. I certainly don't know exactly what happened on the basis on what she took the actions that she did. But I think as a principle, if you're functioning as a minister in a department, it's not unreasonable you should have the kind of support that she's ended up having. And my understanding, as I say, is they've acted very quickly, shut it down in order to save the taxpayer further expense. And I think that was the right thing to do.
Well, Mel Stride, thank you very much for not hiding from us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Now, let's pick up on something we were mentioning earlier, which is Rishi Sunak's interview with Grazia magazine, a video I've become obsessed with. I think I've probably watched it more than any other political video in years. There's just so much in it. But I'm an amateur when it comes to these things, and we're joined by some professionals. Here in the studio is Joe Ellison, who is the editor of the FT magazine HTSI, which I still call How to Spend It. I'm sorry.
Fair enough.
HTSI. And you used to work at Vogue as well, didn't you?
I was, yeah.
And also another Joe Tanner, a political communications strategist who's worked with lots of people, including Boris Johnson. Hello again, Joe.
Hello, nice to see you.
Oh, two Joes.
Yeah, it's not going to be complicated at all.
Okay. So, do you know what? Let's let everyone join in my obsession, and we'll just listen to a little bit of this really quite strange interview with the Prime Minister and his wife, where they're talking about how they divvy up the household chores, which was to mark International Women's Day.
I love being with the kids and setting up the table and making sure that it's all nice, and somehow about the table I really love doing all of that up.
Hard choice, dishwasher stacking, making bed, both have a nice, satisfying ending.
See, I just think what I find fascinating about these kind of interviews as we head into an election year and politicians feel the need to do far more of them is that, because doing the job I do, I watch and read and listen to every interview that every political leader does that I can get hold of, is that I think they're genuinely revealing.
Yeah.
I think you get a sense of character that when I'm asking him about the national insurance cut or whatever, you don't to the same extent, or I might pick up on it, but it doesn't really come across for the viewer. Is there something in that, do you think, with these kind of interviews?
I think there's a mistaken thought that you're doing a soft interview when you're doing those things, and you're speaking to a different audience who is, I think they assume less intelligent, and they just are caught off guard so often. They just don't really think about the repercussions or the minutiae of detail that they're giving away, and they just make terrible blunders. And it's just a case a lot of the time of just being a bit blasé about it.
Do you think this was a blunder for Rishi Sunak?
I think there's a bit of a lack. There's a lack of thought about it. I mean, she literally can't think of the chores that she performs. She sort of talks about liking tables, but she doesn't really talk through the kind of specifics. I actually do think he likes making a bed because he seemed very attached to it. But I sense throughout it, there was, watching him, you could see this sort of flicker of kind of sort of domestic irritation with his wife, who seemed to kind of frustrate him in many ways, and also fear. I think he could see it was slightly unravelling, or he could sense it was unravelling.
There was two things that jumped out at me. That one was he basically tells off his wife at least 3 times.
All the time.
He even tells her off back in time for eating in her bed when she was a student, and he goes, disgusting. And then there's also the bit where you can just see written all over his face for a fraction of a second, why am I doing this? And that's like, neither of those things are a sign of a good interview, are they?
So I wondered straight away, was it on the Monday when he hadn't eaten? It's the first
because he fasts.
Whenever he does anything now, I'm thinking, is this a fasting day? Because I know what I'm like when I'm tired and I'm hungry, and I'm thinking, was this kind of just before the fast was broken, or was this kind of late afternoon on a Monday? When did this happen? So I wouldn't want to have not stacked the dishwasher right if that was also the day. But I think, sometimes the setup of these things, it's fascinating to think, what were the parameters? If it was for International Women's Day, like, I'd have immediately gone, we're not even getting into chores. Why are we talking about that stuff? Like,
it's not International Women's Day in 1953.
Exactly. Like, I would have been and I don't believe the team wouldn't have thought of that stuff, but I did wonder, like, how did that come about? Because it didn't feel right to me. But, Theresa May did the whole pink jobs and blue jobs thing when she talked about her
taking
and
the
Philip
bins
May.
out.
Girl
and who
jobs
took the
and boy
bins out.
jobs, on the one show. Oh, in fact, we've got a clip of that.
Well, there's give and take in every marriage, isn't there? Of course.
Yeah.
I get to decide when I take the bins out. Not if I take the bins out.
But I mean, of
There's
course,
boy jobs and girl jobs, you see.
There's boy jobs and girl jobs.
What boy and girl jobs?
I definitely do the taking the bins out. I do the traditional boy jobs by and large.
The thing is, though, I do find myself on a human level just thinking, if you transpose it into your own life.
Absolutely, 100%.
It'd be excruciating. Imagine that.
But it's deliciously candid. It's like that is a tiny snapshot of what their actual marriage is about. Like they genuinely argue about like who's going to take the bins
But
out.
as a Prime Minister, he was saying that he would leave the office and go up to make the bed.
Yes.
And I'm like, what meeting did you interrupt because you were worried about the
I don't
bed?
think he interrupts meetings. And also his office is 3 flights of stairs from his
But come
bedroom.
on, like he's apparently a man who is so bothered about efficiency that he takes planes because he doesn't want to waste time on a train. 5 minutes by 5 minutes is allocated, and he's got time to go up and make the bed and not wait till later on.
These interviews are revealing. They are revealing of character, aren't they?
Well, do you remember Ed Miliband and the 2 kitchens?
2 kitchens, yeah.
And of course, there's lots of back and forth about whether the second kitchen really was a kitchen or whether it was more just like a sort of cupboard
with a kettle in
it.
And someone priced up the Cameron House when they did their at home and worked out that it was sort of like 350 grand's worth of sort of like general kitchen appliances. I mean, they always backfire. I can't think of any.
Do they always backfire?
I can think of very, very few examples of a political kind of domestic at-home environment which hasn't gone horribly wrong.
James Brokenshire had the 4 ovens as well,
yes,
God rest his
did.
soul.
Yes,
no
he
longer with
did.
us, but that was mentioned, I think, when people wrote about his death. They mentioned the 4 ovens after he'd gone.
But I think the other thing around it is that they're terrified of exposing something about their personal circumstances, or in this instance, their excessively large incomes. I think when you're a kind of an Angela Rayner or someone who's come from a very different background, it can be you're not frightened, you're not hiding anything, so you can kind of go. And we used to do interviews with far more Labour politicians than Tory politicians when I was at Vogue, because a Labour politician
They'd just say yes, would they, basically?
They would just do them because they just felt much more comfortable, I think.
I wonder how we judge whether or not it's failed, though. I mean, outside of the sort of nerdocracy of people who obsess about
I'm
politics.
afraid I think there are definitely a bunch of men out there that are going, my wife can't load the dishwasher either. I know exactly where he's coming from. I'm sure that conversation between
thing, or there's just something.
There probably is. There probably are people going, actually, despite the money and despite the job and all of that, they actually have those same frictions that lots of other marriages actually have. So even the fact we're talking about it and saying we'd seen it, well, it is. We don't see much of, the Prime Minister's wife. She's not really done. She's been doing her lessons at 10 and stuff in Number 10 more so. And I was disappointed that she didn't sound like she did anything other than read books and go to walk the dog and stuff. And that she's doing stuff, but she didn't reflect that in that interview.
Very comfortable in front of the camera.
Very much so, yeah. And I think she was pretty. I think despite the initial nerve, she was actually pretty competent in the party conference speech she did when she introduced him. So she is someone they could use more. Maybe that's not exactly the right format, or maybe they needed other talking points, but. I think there will be marriages where they'll sit there and go, yeah, you don't load the dishwasher right either.
But it's also extinguished any conversation really about the budget in the kind of popular kind of pub chat. That's not what people are talking. They're probably not discussing the kind of urgency with which we're going to abolish national insurance if we do, blah, blah, blah. They're talking about like, oh yeah, do you worry about the beds or who takes? So I've
been guilty of that even on this programme.
Well, yeah,
it's about politics.
Exactly. You've got the opportunity to kind of like move the conversation away.
But somehow our political conversation in the round would be a lot narrower if politicians weren't willing to do this sort of thing, I think. I mean, I accept the sort of thing that people, oh gosh, cringy, blah, blah, blah. But if people are making a decision in an election year, not just about a platter of policies, but trying to make a judgment on character, on personality, on the human at the heart of a political party, if you like, these things do get to something, I think, that, as I say, when I'm sat doing a more formal big P political interview, we don't. And in that sense, I don't know. I think there would be a loss if these things didn't happen. If politicians found themselves sufficiently spooked that they always said no when the call came in.
I think we do have a problem of politicians not being willing to talk about why they go into politics. And I think for some, they actually do have very personal motivations, experiences, childhood, things with their families that have gone on. And you sort of hear it from people where there's supposedly been a struggle or it's been harder. But actually, that doesn't mean that people that had a middle class background or upbringing doesn't mean that they might have had a dad that hit their mum, or they didn't have a sort of period of poverty, or it's sort of assumed that certain people almost, I think it's suggested they don't have a right to talk about that stuff. And I think those sorts of environments are where sometimes we see more of that. Rishi did some stuff with ITV where he had a journalist follow him around and, went into the pharmacy that his mum used to own and talked about what he used to do and how he used to count the tablets out. And Keir Starmer went back to where he lived as well.
Pre-prepared anecdotal journeys, though. I much prefer a kind of slightly off-the-cuff faux pas about who did walk the dog yesterday, which feels much more...
But Joe, it's because Joe's looking at it from a political strategy point of view, the person who's had to arrange the interview and coach the person. You're looking at it from a journalist point of view.
Utterly boring. You're looking. Yeah, you want the scoop, don't you?
But there's a balance of the two. I think the point is, if we want to see these people, there's a balance of the two to be struck.
And also the kind of the power of the camera means that people will be inadvertently revealing, I think. Even when you have kind of perhaps coached through some answers, or how would you approach this particular question about whatever, people will be inadvertently revealing of character or instinct, or how they, particularly when they're in that kind of conversation, say with a spouse or whatever it might be, and even maybe in those environments that are a little bit coached. I don't know.
I think they're definitely underprepared. I think a lot of the time they just think it's a soft environment. These people are a load of patsies. I can say whatever I like and it won't matter, and I'll just I'll just bathe in the reflected glory of my domestic kind of like loveliness. And they don't think, they assume, I think it's maybe the political mind as well, that you're just so obsessed with like the politics of every day and the kind of tiny little interactions that happen there that you sort of forget how to be a normal human being.
They lose their identities. They're told how to vote. They're told what to think on stuff. They go in as these, they've got egos and they've got ideas, but then that sort of gets knocked out of a lot of them because of the whipping system and the way the party structure works. And then you get those real firebrands like a Carolyn Harris who sort of picks up a big issue and fights for it in tooth and nail, and you think, yes, a campaigning MP. And I think we I think sometimes the pressure then gets to them as well as they get higher up that sort of ladder, and suddenly it's, who am I anymore? What do I stand for? Can I show that side of me?
Well, I always remember David Cameron saying he hadn't been allowed to drive a car for such a long time, and he actually looked a bit sad about it, and I felt a bit sad on his behalf. Joe, help us out with just like the taxonomy of the different magazines. Like, who is reading which one, and who do the politicians think they're reaching when they go in these magazines? Because obviously, like, the stereotype for Vogue would be that it's like an ultra fashionista person.
Well, I think that's wealthy. I think that they assume that it's a luxury environment, as they do with HTSI. So they're basically sort of speaking to people who are on a kind of significant income, private educated children. They're not going to have an issue with like people talking about staff. Is it going to be something like Grazia, which is far more kind of every woman kind of magazine? It has a broad demographic. I'd say it's very kind of like the Mondeo man of the Grazia woman, probably fits the same sort of pattern. They're probably trying to speak to someone in their sort of 25 to 35, 38-year-old, very influential voter. So I think they probably thought they were doing a great piece of work for a voter that is very much sitting on the fence at the moment, probably ambivalent politically, I would have thought.
Joe, the media landscape is just so massive now, and there's so many new things popping up. What do you think we haven't seen politicians doing yet?
That 30 maybe to 50 sort of year old woman was something that I remember back working with Boris, back in 2007, 2008, was a really big focus. And it still is for a lot of politicians. But actually what's interesting is that magazine-wise, it's kind of irrelevant because it was actually just about social media. Right. It just became about, they used that channel to put that out. They just used that as a vehicle. So really it was just about getting it to you guys reading it. You wouldn't probably have gone and bought Grazia normally, but you'd buy it because you know that he's going to be in it. But actually the socials have gone way ahead of that anyway. So the old structures have kind of changed.
Right. Well, the exit sign is flashing for us because it's the end of this episode of Newscast. Thanks very much for coming in, you two.
Thank you.
And Chris, I'll see you for the next big news event, which will probably be along very soon.
Yeah.
And we'll have another episode of Newscast for you very soon too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.
This is a violent and brutal murder.
The first thing we need to establish is how